Hey guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're talking about the Civil War. That's right, the war between the states, also known as the War of Southern Secession, or the Second American Revolution, the War of Rebellion, or the War for the Union. You see, it really doesn't matter what we call it. America was divided. And that division is going to lead us into a war which is going to completely change who we are as a country moving forward. So let's get right into it. The U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War spanned over a 4-year period. In fact, it lasted almost exactly 4 years. And if you remember, it started shortly after the election of 1860. Now, the election of 1860 had 4 candidates running for the office of presidency. You had Abraham Lincoln representing the Republican Party, and they presented what was known as the Free Soil Platform, a platform intended to stop the spread of slavery. Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge split the Democratic Party. Stephen Douglas supported the idea of popular sovereignty in the territories, meaning that the people could choose whether or not they wanted slavery in their territory, whereas John Breckinridge supported those who believed that slavery had the constitutional backing to spread to wherever it wanted to within the United States. Finally, you had John Bell, who supported the Constitutional or Union Party. They really didn't even address the issue of slavery. Well, as you know, when this election panned out, it's going to be Lincoln who wins. And what Lincoln walks into as the president is a divided country, almost an unfinished country. In 1861, he is going to give the first inaugural address on the steps of an unfinished Capitol. And this is kind of a symbolic representation of where our country was at this time. You see, the Capitol building was undergoing modifications due to the fact that our government had grown so much, we needed to make more room. Well, that's kind of where we were as a country. So the unfinished Capitol kind of represents the United States at this time. We're growing so much that we have to restructure how we do things. The first shots of the Civil War are going to be fired at Fort Sumter. Now, this is going to happen several weeks after Lincoln's first inaugural address. And in that address, he had basically said, I don't want to interfere with slavery where it exists at all. And he also addressed the fact that several states had already seceded from the Union. And he said that they didn't have the right to secede. Now, the southern states were holding on to that old idea, the compact theory, the idea that they came into the Constitution and it was more of an agreement between the states and not like binding, so they could leave whenever they wanted. Well, Lincoln's going to argue that's not true. And he's going to go into the presidency as the president of the entire United States of America. Well, Fort Sumter laid in South Carolina territory, and the Confederate government had informed the U.S. government that they needed to remove their troops from federal forts and positions. Well, Lincoln's not going to do that. In fact, what he's going to do is he's going to send a ship down to resupply Fort Sumter. When that happens, the Confederate government sees that as an act of war because U.S. ships had come into Confederate territory and they are going to attack Fort Sumter. This is going to unite the northern states. Up until this point, I'm sure there were people out there saying, let them go, whatever. We don't want to deal with it. But once they attack Fort Sumter, the northern states are going to unite, and the Confederacy is going to unite as well. When you look at this war on paper, there is no way the South had any chance at all. I mean, the North outnumbered the South in everything: population, money, factories, food. I mean, I guess, the South had more donkeys and mules, but okay. I don't think anybody can win a war with donkeys and mules, but maybe they can. Another thing the North had that the South didn't have was infrastructure. Look at these railroad maps. Look at the comparison of the railroad lines available in the North versus the South. This is going to play a huge role in the war later because the South is not going to be able to resupply itself. This is Henry Clay in action. This goes all the way back to the American system. in which infrastructure was focused in the North and the West and not the South. It's going to come back and bite the southern states very quickly in this war. The advantages the Union have, like I mentioned before, industry, transportation. They also had a navy. Their government was established. They weren't creating as they went. More population than the South. And finally, emancipation of the slaves. This is going to play a huge role in the war when we get to 1863. Some of the disadvantages that the North had, they didn't have very good leaders. When you look at the generals in the North and the South at the beginning of the war, the South had the stronger military generals, more experience, higher quality as far as strategies and stuff like that. And then in the very beginning of the war, this is a big weakness. They didn't have a purpose. They really didn't know why they were fighting. Like I said, a lot of people thought, if the South wants to leave, let them leave. Why would you fight to keep them here? The South, they had the South's biggest advantage, all they had to do was defend. See, in order for the South to lose, the North had to win. Now, I know that might not make a lot of sense, but the South could have won this war had they fought to a tie. If the North had just said, it's just not worth it, South wins. If the North loses, South wins. The only way they can lose is if the North wins this war. And to win the war, the North has to invade the South and take down the South. All the Confederacy had to do was just defend themselves. They had a purpose they were fighting for. They had a goal. As I mentioned earlier, strong leadership. And then one thing they were counting on at the beginning of war is what we call cotton diplomacy. They really believed that their cotton crops would provide an international alliance with some countries that would actually provide the funds they need to fight the war. Their disadvantages, I've already talked about them. No navy, no infrastructure, and a very weak government. Several states are going to play a key role in the war very early. We call them the border states: Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. Lincoln's goal from the very beginning was to keep these states in the Union. Now, these are slave states, so it would make sense that they would go over to the Confederate side. But by keeping them in the Union, that's going to prevent the men from those states from fighting for the Confederacy. It's going to take any possible manufacturing opportunities that the South might have away, because some of these states had factories in them. And their location is very important, especially Maryland. Maryland sits on the border with Virginia, and Washington, D.C. sits on the border between Maryland and Virginia. Had Maryland gone to the Confederacy, that would mean that the U.S. Capitol would have been located in the Confederacy. The very first battle fought in this war is going to be the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Manassas. In this battle, Irwin McDowell is going to take his Confederate troops into battle, and they are going to whomp up on the Union troops. What's funny about this battle, and I always like to tell this story, is people thought this war was just going to be very short-lived. And because Bull Run was so close in proximity to Washington, D.C., no one wanted to miss it. So you had dignitaries and senators and representatives, very important people from Washington, D.C., they actually went out to try to watch the Battle of Bull Run. Took picnic baskets with them, only to see the Union put in full retreat. McDowell is going to chase the Union back towards Washington, D.C., but he didn't have the support he believed he needed to continue the chase. And so the Union will make it back to Washington, D.C. Had McDowell actually chased the Union Army all the way back to the Capitol, in hindsight, there was a good opportunity they could have taken down Washington, D.C. that day. But he didn't get it done. One reason why McDowell is going to be fired. One of the biggest turning points in the war is going to be the Battle of Antietam. Now, Antietam is the bloodiest single day of the war. Antietam is located in Maryland, Sharpsburg, Maryland, so sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg. Why this was a turning point was because there was a possibility that England and other foreign countries were about to enter the war on the side of the Confederacy, which would have made a huge difference. When the South was not able to win this battle, I mean, technically, I think it was a Northern victory, but there was 23,000 casualties in this single day of fighting. Well, when that happened, Europeans turned their back on this war. They wanted nothing to do with it. So that's why I refer to this as a turning point in the war, especially for the Confederacy. Lincoln is going to make use of his executive power throughout this war. A lot of times when we go into war, if we go into a national crisis, you see a lot of civil liberties disappear. One of the biggest acts of executive power that Lincoln uses has to do with those border states I mentioned earlier. In Maryland, he is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. What that basically does is provide the reasoning why you're being arrested. You just can't be arrested and thrown in jail without charges. That's what habeas corpus is all about. Well, Lincoln suspends that. Well, why did he do that? He had a very important reason. Remember, I told you he wanted to keep the border states in the Union. Well, Maryland was about to vote on whether or not to join the Confederacy. So Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland, and he goes out and starts arresting anybody he thought might vote for secession. Once the vote was held and Maryland chose to stay in the Union, he just let everybody go. It's a misuse of power, I think, if you see that. But like I said, during crisis, civil liberties kind of go out the window. Another thing he did was he ordered a naval blockade of the Confederacy without congressional approval, and he also increased the size of the army without congressional approval. Yes, the president is the commander-in-chief, but he has to get approval from Congress to spend money. And imposing a blockade, increasing the size of the military costs money, and he needs that congressional approval. But at the beginning of the war, Congress was out of session. In fact, they're going to be out of session until about July. So what Lincoln does is he asks Congress to go back retroactively and approve everything he did. And they do. There were a lot of people arguing to free the slaves during this war, and there were several different reasonings why they thought it was important. Number one, militarily, it's going to provide an economic attack on the South because the slaves played a vital role in this war. They were maintaining the farms while the men went off to fight. If the slaves were to go away, that's economically going to devastate the South. Also, the ideological argument. What is that going to do to the morale of the Southern Army? The radical Republicans are really going to try to push Lincoln into freeing the slaves. A couple acts were passed before the Emancipation Proclamation called the Confiscation Acts. The first one said that slaves that were used for insurrectionary purposes or slaves that were used against the Union could be set free. And then they passed the second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves who had been enslaved by anyone who was fighting in the war. You know, it's kind of difficult to free people when you don't have control of the area, and the Union didn't at this point. Nor did they when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, but stick with me here. After the Battle of Antietam, there was a morale boost in the North. And Lincoln is going to justify this as a military necessity. And what he's going to do is he's going to free the slaves in the rebel territory. So all those areas that have seceded from the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation frees all those slaves. It does not free a single slave in the border states. In fact, it really doesn't free any slaves initially because the southern states have seceded. They are not under, as far as they're concerned, the legislative authority of the U.S. government. But the Emancipation Proclamation absolutely has some strong effects. Number one, it's going to give a cause, a reason for the North to fight. Number two, that action, along with the Battle of Antietam, is going to keep Europe completely out of the war. And finally, freed slaves are going to be allowed into the U.S. Army, so new soldiers to fight. Keep in mind, again, the North has no governmental authority in the South, yet this Emancipation Proclamation was very important to the Northern cause. When you look at the map here, like I said, no states in green are going to see any slaves freed initially by this law. And the border states, again, they get to keep their slaves throughout the Civil War. Frederick Douglass is going to push Lincoln to allow African American soldiers to join the Union in order to prove how vital they were to the United States. 180,000 African Americans will serve in the Civil War with the Union Army. One of the most famous regiments is going to be the Massachusetts 54th. And if you really want to understand who these guys were, man, you got to check out the movie Glory. I don't recommend a lot of movies, but this one, absolutely, you need to watch it. Fantastic. But don't think that African Americans were treated equally to American soldiers. They received less money. They received poor equipment. They normally were the last one to get any supplies at all. But they were part of the fight. During the war, there's going to be a lot of political jargoning back and forth. Lincoln's going to have to deal with the radical Republicans who want to go, crazy, He also has to deal with war Democrats. These are Democrats who are still part of Congress from the North. They supported the war, but they did not support Lincoln. Copperheads, part of this equation as well. These are Democrats who not only opposed Lincoln, but opposed the war and wanted to negotiate for peace. And then Lincoln had to deal with something unheard of, an election in the middle of the war. He is actually going to have to run for re-election in the midst of the war. He could have very easily said, no, not going to do it. We're going to put it off, national emergency, we're not going to do it. But he did it. He ran. The Confederacy had their own challenges. Cotton diplomacy was just not working. Quite honestly, Europe was dealing with a surplus of cotton, so they really didn't need Confederate cotton at this point. And then on top of that, the Emancipation Proclamation is kind of going to be weighing over their heads, even though they don't feel like it affects them. As Union soldiers came into the South, they were freeing slaves along their path. And then remember, one of the big reasons the South fought was for states' rights, the rights for states to basically govern themselves. This is going to be kind of hard for them because they need the states to be unified in this fight, yet they're all dealing with their own issues. And so they're not going to want to work that often with the central government. But there was some positive going on in Congress as well. Because there was a Republican majority in Congress during the war, there was a whole bunch of legislation that got passed through that Lincoln wanted to do before this war ever started. The two acts I want to point out is the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act was one thing that Lincoln ran on, was this idea of creating homesteads for farmers in the West. And what the Homestead Act is going to do is give free land away in the western frontier and draw more people out there. And the Pacific Railway Act, there had been a debate throughout Congress for at least 10 years as to where to build a transcontinental railroad. Should it be in the north or should it be in the south? Well, in 1863, they passed the Pacific Railway Act that funded the Transcontinental Railroad and chose the route, which was going to go through Chicago along a northern route. These are big deals, and these are passed in the middle of a war. Gettysburg is another major battle you should probably know, took part in 1863, and it's going to be the South's last venture into Northern territory. It's going to be the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. Remember, Antietam was the bloodiest day, Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle. It's going to be a major defeat for Robert E. Lee as well. I think Gettysburg marks the beginning of the end for the Confederate Army. Still 2 more years to fight, but Gettysburg was a huge loss for them. Also in 1863, you're going to see the U.S. government institute another draft. The Conscription Act is going to be passed in March, and we're going to be drafting men into the Union Army. But what this is going to lead to is what's called $300 men, as well as a lot of draft riots. So what leads them to start riots in New York City against the draft? It's simply this. You were able to, in the Civil War, buy your way out of military service. See, when they sent you a draft notice, it didn't matter if your name was on it. You could send somebody else in your place as long as they got a soldier. Hence the $300 men. Wealthy Northerners could pay economically disadvantaged men $300 and they would go fight for them in their place. So literally you're buying your way out of service. And the Civil War got this nickname. It was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because many of the wealthy didn't fight in the war because they bought their way out. Well, this is going to lead to those riots in New York City, because if you weren't wealthy, you were kind of stuck. And so you're going to have a lot of people fighting against this. But they still found enough people to fight. People were still willing to take the money because their family needed that financial help. The progress of the war was slow. Like I said, a lot of people thought this war would only last a few months. It lasted almost exactly 4 years. And you can see right here the progression of Union troops going into the South. Remember, the Union had to take the South. The South only had to defend. One man who is most responsible for a lot of the movement into the South, specifically the purple area that goes right through Atlanta, is William Tecumseh Sherman. In 1864, he is going to promise a victory to Abraham Lincoln. And he is going to conduct his famous March to the Sea, where he and his troops go through Atlanta, through Georgia, all the way to Savannah, destroying everything in its path. It was called total war. And anything the Southern Army could have used, they destroyed it. They tore up railroad ties. They burned buildings. They burned homes. They looted homes. They salted the ground. And salting the ground makes it infertile. So they couldn't even grow anything. It has a devastating effect on the Confederacy. And it also has a very positive effect on that election I mentioned earlier, the election of 1864, when Lincoln is running for re-election against George McClellan. Now, George McClellan had served twice as Lincoln's commander-in-chief, and Lincoln had fired him twice. McClellan's going to run on the Democratic ticket on the idea that he just wants to end the war. Let's just stop it. Let's just go back to the way it was, because people were getting war-weary and they wanted this to be over. Well, Lincoln's going to win, but it's going to be closer than you might think. Obviously, the Confederate states are not voting at all. But look at McClellan. He got 1.8 million votes in this election, and Lincoln got about 2.2 million. Not many more than he had gotten in the election of 1860. Lincoln is struggling with his popularity during this time. Like I said, people were war-weary, but he did win, and he will be there to see the end of the war. The final campaign is going to be through Virginia, and I'm not going to get into all the battles, but just know the final battle will be fought at Appomattox, and that will be where Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant. This happens on April 9th, 1865, and like I've said a couple times, almost 4 years to the day that the war started. The war started on April 11th, 1865. What's interesting is the folks who lived there at Appomattox Courthouse actually also had a home at the Battle of First Bull Run. Just kind of ironic, I think. You don't need to know that. I just like little facts. This is a picture from Lincoln's second inaugural address. It's in this address that he starts laying the groundwork for reunifying the country. And he gives advice to the people of the North, saying that we must move forward with malice towards none and charity towards all. Lincoln's speech addressed the anger towards the South, addressed the fact that the South was going to have to pay for this war and what happened. But he also said we need to be able to move forward. And that's what he meant by with malice towards none. Let's let the anger go and let's bring them back in. Almost as the prodigal son. These are our brothers and our sisters. Let's bring them back in. One person at that speech who probably didn't agree with Lincoln that much, you can see him right there in the circle, John Wilkes Booth. This is the man that several days after the Civil War ends will assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. When you look at the impact of the Civil War, it's huge. Nearly 700,000 young men were killed. This was almost an entire generation of young men. The Southern economy is going to be destroyed. But we did get certain legislation passed, like the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. So our country is still moving forward. The Union victory is going to pretty much halt any further discussion about secession or nullification. Kind of died out with the Civil War. And finally, probably the biggest impact on our country will be the freeing of 4 million slaves and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery in our country. How we deal with that is going to be a challenge, and that will usher in a new time period of American history called Reconstruction. Thanks for listening. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to put them down in the comments. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.